Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Triangulation, episode 208, recorded July 13th, 2015. Robert Stone and Pandora's Promise. This episode of Triangulation is brought to you by the Ring Video Doorbell. With Ring, you can see and talk to anyone at your door from anywhere in the world using your smartphone. It's like caller ID for your home. Get $25 off the Ring Video Doorbell when you go to ring.com/triangulation. And by Prosper. Prosper is a peer-to-peer lending marketplace that connects people who are looking to borrow money with those who have money to lend. Visit prosper.com/twit and receive a $50 Visa gift card when you get a loan. Welcome to Triangulation. It's the show on the Twit TV network where we talk to fascinating people about fascinating subjects, and we've got a good episode for you today. We're talking to documentary filmmaker, Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker, Robert Stone. Robert, thank you very much for coming on to Triangulation.
I'm glad to be here.
I spoke with you a while back, I think it was maybe half a year ago, about your movie Pandora's Promise. I wanted to bring you back on the Triangulation to talk about your work as a whole, because you've done way more than one documentary about nuclear power. First, for the folks at home, can you explain a little bit about your corpus of work? You started in, what was it, 1987 with Bikini Radio. And I'm sorry? Radio Bikini. And for that work, you were nominated for an Oscar. Can you tell me what that documentary was about?
It was a film about the first atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll out in the Pacific in 1946. It was the first big U.S. atomic bomb test after World War II, and it was a huge media event. 42,000 people were involved in the operation, and they used the U.S. Navy set out to make a huge propaganda film about it. They actually employed half the world's supply of motion picture film, and everything kind of got screwed up. And they decided not to finish the film, and they took all this film and locked it away in an archive in a vault in Washington for decades. And I got access to this and ended up making a movie about this atomic bomb test. It was sort of a pivotal moment in the very early beginnings of the Cold War, and kind of set the stage for what came after.
That was an interesting documentary in that you were able to take what had been created, as you mentioned, as a propaganda film. It was something that was supposed to make the American people feel better about the nuclear arms that were keeping the world safe. And I have to imagine that at some point, one of their people was looking at the footage saying, "This is terrifying. This is horrific. We can't release this. This is going to have the exact opposite effect." Now, you come into this film years and years later. What was your reaction? What made you say, "I want to turn this into a documentary"?
Well, I had actually wanted to make a film about the whole testing program in Bikini. It kind of, I don't know, it was an interesting idea for me. The whole contrast between nuclear weapons, which is, horrible devastation, and paradise. And these two things coming together, and, a very sophisticated, developed country, the United States, interacting with these these islanders who were living at a very, almost pre-industrial state, very primitively on these islands, even as late as 1946. So I thought, well, that was an interesting thing to make a film about. And then I found this cache of never before seen archival footage. A lot of it's in color, and saw the opportunity. As a filmmaker, it was a great opportunity to make a film about that actually would almost flow like a feature film, as if I'd been able to go back in time and make a documentary about this thing. There was just so much footage. I was able to really recreate the entire event, and it got widely seen. I mean, it's still available on iTunes to this day, and it does quite well. So,
a very unique experience. But I did want to talk about something related to that, and that is I have friends and colleagues who make documentaries, and what I find with some of them is they tend to get stuck in a theme. There's something that they're very passionate about, and which is the reason why they wanted to become a documentary filmmaker in the first place. And they basically go from film to film to film that are variations of that theme. You did something very different for your second film, which was years and years later. It was over a decade after your first film. You did The Taking of Patty Hearst. It was a film called Gorilla that you released in 2004. That's a huge swing. What made you want?
I actually made a lot of films in between. I've been pretty busy.
Okay, but yeah, yes. But I mean, that was the one. The next one that really
got a lot of attention.
It got a lot of attention. It got a lot of acclaim. But what makes you swing from the Bikini Atoll test to Patty Hearst?
I think those two stories are actually quite related. One was a big media event in 1946 about nuclear weapons, and another was a big media event in 1974 about domestic terrorism. So, I mean, both of those films are portraits of huge media events and dissections of media events, and both films are based on uncovering a lot of never before seen footage. So, I mean, in that sense, they're kind of related. But I didn't. What you say is true. There's a lot of documentary filmmakers, I think, get into this business because they're like political activists first, and they see documentary filmmaking as a way of communicating their activism. I've never been an activist. I got into documentary filmmaking because I was interested in film. I never imagined I was going to really make my entire career to be as a documentary filmmaker. I thought I was going to make feature films, narrative films, but it just didn't turn out that way. I got kind of sucked into documentaries. I love documentaries, but I don't. I'm not using documentary to advance some sort of political cause.
And I think that comes through in your films, especially in Pandora's Promise. One of the things that struck me, because I watched Pandora's Promise before I knew who you were, before I had ever interviewed you. And people had been suggesting it, but I was very wary because I thought it was going to be one of these activist films where everything was going to be melodramatic and overdrawn. And I found it incredibly well balanced, which it's a storytelling. That's what you do. You're a storyteller and you like to tell a narrative. So take me through the process of you choosing what your next story is going to be. You pointed out that both Bikini Atoll and the Patty Hearst story were big media events. But what is it that triggers in you that reaction saying, I bet this is something I could dive into, I could tell a great story?
Well, I'm mostly mining my childhood, really, and trying to make sense of it. I mean, I grew up in I was born in 1958, and I grew up in a college town in Princeton, New Jersey. My dad was a professor there. So I saw the 60s as a little kid in a college town where there was a lot of, activism against the war. And, I was 10 years old when they landed on the moon. I was, 13 when Watergate happened. I mean, the assassinations and I don't know, all kinds of crazy things happened when I was a kid. Like when there was almost really a revolution going on in France in 1968. My father, who was a history professor who'd studied and written about revolutions, suddenly said, "Oh, wow, there's a revolution going on. I want to go see this." And me and my dad, we flew on a plane over to Paris, and he just showed me around as like there were tear gas and rocks flying through the air and red flags flying from government buildings. And I remember one building had a black flag on it. I was like, "What's that, Daddy?" He goes, "Oh, those are anarchists who've taken over that building." I was like, "What's an anarchist?" And I don't know. So I led this really weird childhood and living through this very odd period of history, and I was very curious about it. And I think, a lot of the films I've made have been going back and revisiting that time and trying to make sense of it for myself and for other people of my generation, also for young people who didn't live through that, but who are still living with the sort of echoes of that today. So, I must have been like 15, I think, when the Patty Hearst kidnapping happened, and everybody was watching it, and everybody was talking about it. It was just, but nobody. It was just this mysterious thing that happened, and I was amazed that nobody had ever really made a film about it. You know, so I decided maybe that's something I ought to do.
You know, two things strike me about that. First, your father is an amazing person for having brought you into that. I think a first sort of inclination of many parents is to shield their kids from the things in the world that don't make sense. The fact that your father wanted to put you in the middle of it, that's unique, that's special. The second thing is I love this idea of you using your filmmaking to make sense of your childhood, make sense of your life. I've never heard of it described that way, but yeah, that makes absolute sense.
Let me tell you an interesting story about Radio Bikini. When I made the film, you know, I'm out going to film festivals, and everybody's asking me, you know, well, what started you to make this film? And I always had some story, you know, why did I get interested in it? And I think I kind of told you the same story actually today. Well, the true story is actually a little bit more interesting. And, you know, as a priest, a man of the cloth, you might be interested in this. This gets into human psychology. But my mother, who was a very intelligent and very interesting lady, when I was very, very little, she was pushing me along in my pram, and we lived in England in those days, so we called it a pram. And I had the seat that I had in my pram faced her, and she's pushing me along. And she would always tell me things that she was reading in the newspaper. You know, I must have been like 2, maybe 3 years old. But she always told me all these interesting things, and I'm like looking up at her, like trying to absorb all this. Well, she starts going on telling me a story about how when she was a kid, she and her father used to make up this, they used to have a story, a game that they played together where they would imagine that they were going to run away to this island in the Pacific. And they talked about this island and the palm trees and what their life was going to be like. It was just like a game that they played. And she was telling me this story. And then she said, well, you know, Robert, this morning I read in the newspaper that they just dropped an atomic bomb on this island that me and my dad used to imagine we were going to run away to. So I've just been sort of introduced, you know, I'm in cold, rainy little England and introduced to this beautiful vision of paradise and palm trees. And then now she's talking about atomic bombs. And I go, what's an atomic bomb? So she proceeds to describe an atomic bomb to me. So obviously these two things got conflated in my mind at a very early age. So when I read about the atomic testing at Bikini, a light bulb went off, and I don't know, I felt drawn to this story, but it took me many years, like making the film, finishing the film, and going out and talking about the film before I actually had this memory of what probably triggered it in the first place.
So your mother's telling you about this wonderful place that she'd like to retire to, and then you have a vision of it being blasted into nothing but an atomic bomb.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would definitely leave an impression.
That's where ideas come from. I mean, I've been fortunate to actually spend my life making films about things that I'm deeply passionate about and I really care about and speak to things inside of me. And in that sense, part of it is an ability to sort of travel through time and space. And you know, I mean, any filmmaker will tell you being a filmmaker is a bit like playing God. You do really get a chance to manipulate time and space. And with documentaries, archival-based documentaries, part of what you get to do is to travel back in time.
Let's talk a little bit about that traveling back in time, because one of your next films was called Oswald's Ghost, which you made in 2007. Now, it's a JFK assassination documentary, but it's not a JFK assassination documentary because, unlike a lot of the other documentaries, you didn't get caught up in magic bullets and conspiracy. You wanted to show what it did to American culture, what it did to the American psyche, which I find fascinating. Again, that's one of those pieces that I like about your work, which is you take a story that most of us have heard about. We all heard about Bikini Atoll. We all heard about Patty Hearst. But then you figured out a different way to frame it that makes it interesting again. How did you come by that idea?
Well, again, you know, my family had moved from England, and we arrived in the United States in September 1963, and coming from, you know, little old England, which was really kind of a backwards sort of place in the early 60s. It's hard to even imagine. You know, rationing from the war had ended in like 1955. I mean, You know, things were pretty grim there. So coming to JFK's America, and as a little kid, I mean, it was like arriving at Disneyland or something. And then, like, within 3 months of being here, boom, he's shot, and you know, all of this is on television. And I remember I was stayed home from school. Well, I think we were all home from school when Oswald was killed on live television. You know, I mean, it's all pretty shocking for a little kid. And then the reverberations from that, really, the whole mistrust of government, the sort of loss of faith in America that I witnessed as a little kid. Again, it was all sort of unexplained and mysterious. Was it all about Vietnam? You know, and if it was all about Vietnam, then why did it, or was it about a social revolution? I don't know. It was all very confusing about what was really driving us. And years later, I felt I wanted to explore how the Kennedy assassination played a role in that. Because a lot of people I talked to, older people who were of a generation older than me, always spoke about how that was the break. You know, when Kennedy was killed, like, just everything changed. And I think one of the reasons that changed was because it felt like it was unresolved, like there was some vast conspiracy where the government was somehow involved in killing him. And if you believe that, if you get up every morning, brush your teeth, and go to work, you know, like, believing that the U.S. government conspired to kill Kennedy and that nobody's talked about it, and there were 20 people, you know, guns on Dealey Plaza, you know, it was a hit. And, you know, and people in power know this, but, you know, you haven't been told because, you know, it's a big conspiracy. Well, that's going to affect everything in your life, about whether you vote, you know, what your political values are, how you view the world, how you regard, you know, random experiences or even disasters like 9/11. You know, was that a conspiracy? How do you interpret that? I think that sort of worldview starts to cloud things. So I made a film that explored that, and the sort of running. I usually try to come up with a sort of a one sentence sort of phrase to define what I'm doing that kind of defines the project as we're editing it, and the running phrase in that movie was, this is not a whodunit, it's a what the whodunit has done to us.
Right.
And I think that kind of captured it, and it kept coming back, like, what is this mystery or this lack of resolution done to us as Americans? And so it really did, it was a new twist on the thing. And Norman Mailer was sort of the star of the film because he had the whole conspiracy concept about the Kennedy assassination had really informed his entire worldview, and was made its way into many of the books that he'd written. And then in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he got access to the KGB records on Oswald, because Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union for a time. And he felt he was going to crack the case and finally figure out what happened. And in the course of 5 years of writing the book, he completely changed his mind and came out the other side, and came to the conclusion that Oswald had in fact acted alone. I thought that was fascinating. I'm interested in people who will change their minds about something very fundamental about their belief, because I find them to be, I'm that way, and I find them to be sort of curious and interesting people who just have one vision and think the same thing regardless of any sort of new information that comes their way the whole life. I don't find those kind of people very interesting or compelling. They're just saying the same thing over and over again. They're not responsive to any kind of debate or dialogue. So
let's talk about that, because you are fascinated by people who change their worldview, and actually that does come up in your documentaries time and time again, especially as you started talking about environmentalism. I believe Earth Days in 2009 was one of your more popular forays into that topic, where you were talking about how here's a group of people who believe very strongly in what they're doing, and that what they have as a vision for the Earth is the right way to do it. But then you like to show the nuances about how ideas can change, and about how the convictions you held so strongly can somehow, over time, not be destroyed, but be matured. Is that an element of your storytelling that you like to bring from documentary to documentary?
I think it's an element of life. I mean, it should be an element of life. It should be an element of one's evolution as a human being and thinking about these things. I mean, maybe I think about these things too much, probably more than most people. But, you know, yeah, as you mature and you get older and you've had more life experience, and facts change, times change, situations change, that your thinking and your analysis of the world around you should change in response to that, you know? Otherwise, you're just stuck in some sort of worldview that you had when you were 20 years old based on that time and place, and you're inflexible, you know? You're not living in the time that you're existing in. You're just living in some past framework. And I don't find that interesting. I mean, I like to wake up and read about things, and I read the newspaper. I like to read articles by people who have a completely different perspective than my own, because, you know, I can say, oh, that's totally wrong. I don't agree with them. But sometimes they've got something valid to say that I find interesting, and it helps inform my view. If I was just, I think one of the problems today is people are more, with the internet and everything, people more and more are getting their information from selected sources, and they only read things that conform and reinforce their worldview. They don't ever see the other side. So people who hold contrary points of view end up being demonized. Like, they can't, no rational person could possibly think that, because, you know, they must be evil, or they must be in the pay of some nefarious force, because they're obviously so completely wrong. And I think that comes from just not being exposed to that other side. I mean, as we know in the United States, I mean, the most racist people are people who live in, you know, all white enclaves, for instance, or, you know, the gay rights movement. The reason that the whole issue of gay marriage changed so quickly is so many gay people came out, and everybody realized, like, oh, their uncle or their neighbor down the road has a, you know, there's somebody new, somebody in their intimate, close circle of friends and family was gay, and therefore they changed. It was not something they were going to be prejudiced against. And I think in the world of ideas, that's really important too, is to be exposed to different points of view and not just see the world through this little prism of your, you know, your Facebook feed and your pre-selected news items from sources that agree with your perspective.
Speaking of shattering our perspectives, one of the most, I'm going to say violent, because it does get violent sometimes, chats that we have here in the Twit Army is about power, the future of power, the future of green power, nuclear power. So I'd like to, when we come back from the break, talk a little bit about your work with eco-modernism, and of course about your film Pandora's Promises. Is that possible?
Absolutely. That's what I'm here for.
We're speaking, of course, with documentary filmmaker, Oscar-nominated director Robert Stone. We'll be right back, but before that, let's go ahead and take a break and thank the first sponsor of this episode of Triangulation. Now, let me ask you something. Are you using an old doorbell? You know that one, the really simple one where you push the button and it rings a bell on the inside of the house? Because if you are, you're using technology from the last millennium. And I'm not just saying that facetiously. I mean, literally from almost 60, 70 years ago. That's what you've got telling you whether or not someone's at your home. Every other type of technology has grown up. Your thermostat, your security system, your radio system, your means of communication. So why are you still using something from last century, from the dark ages of technology? Well, if you want to upgrade your house, if you want to turn your house into something smarter, you need to try Ring. Now, what is Ring? Ring, quite simply, is a video doorbell. They recognize that over 90% of home break-ins happen during the day, and they recognize that most burglars start by ringing your doorbell to see if somebody's home. Well, Ring tries to solve that system by giving you this. This is what their video doorbell kit looks like. It's a self-contained kit that includes everything you need, everything from the video doorbell itself to the bits and the bytes and the screws and the mounts and even a level to make sure that you can install this thing properly. This replaces your doorbell. This has a lithium-ion battery inside that can be charged via a USB port, which will last for 1 year, or you could just power it off of house power and never have to worry about charging it at all. It connects to your Wi-Fi network and then allows you to answer the door from your smartphone, from your tablet, no matter where you are. Imagine being able to, well, bring up an application on your phone like this. This is the Ring application on my Android phone. Also works on iOS, and I can see that I have a missed call. I mean, someone came to my house in Henderson, Nevada, where my parents are, and they tried to ring the doorbell. It will actually give me a video of what that person looked like. I can download it to my phone in case I want to save it because I'm worried about someone casing my house. And it'll also tell me if there's motion in the front of my house. I got to tell you, folks, this is a revolution in what it means to have a safe home. Now, right now, Ring wants you to install a system in your home, and they're going to make it easy. They're going to give you $25 off just because you're a member of the Twit TV Army. That's right, for $174, you can get peace of mind knowing that your home is protected and knowing that you've updated that really old piece of tech that, well, essentially turns your house into caller ID. Right now, again, you can get the Ring Video Doorbell for $174. That's $25 off the normal price. Protect your home, have a peace of mind, and get smart. Go to ring.com/triangulation. That's ring.com/triangulation. And we thank Ring for their support of Triangulation. We're speaking with Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker Robert Stone. And now we're going to move to a film that really opened me to your work. And I'd say it not necessarily changed my mind, but definitely informed me about the issues involved in nuclear power. Pandora's Promise. Now, the lead into that is, of course, you are involved in this movement with more than just making a film. You are also the co-founder of the Energy for Humanity organization, which is based in London, and you are the co-author of the Ecomodernist Manifesto. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The manifesto?
Yes.
All right. Well, out of making Pandora's Promise, I went around the world talking about nuclear energy and climate change and energy issues, and kind of stumbled into becoming kind of a spokesman for what's a growing movement of environmental thinkers who are really taking a very different approach to our environmental problems than the mainstream environmental movement. In fact, we are directly critiquing the environmental movement that I grew up with and came of age with and made a movie about, actually, with Earth Days. And Pandora's Promise was a part of that critique and became a focus of it because it was a film and got a lot of attention. And so out of that experience and out of meeting so many of the people I met along on this journey, I was invited to be a co-author along with 18 other, or 17 other people, there's 18 co-authors, of a document. You can get it online. It's called the Ecomodernist Manifesto. And I suppose, you know, in its most basic form, it's the environmental movement. Their basic sort of philosophical approach is that the core problem that we face with our environmental challenges can be found in that we have removed ourselves from nature too much. We need to get back in touch with nature. We need to reconnect human civilization, our economy, and everything, and get it more in tune with natural forces. That it's sort of human hubris and rampant human development that has sort of separated us from nature, and we need to get back in touch with it. And that will solve environmental problems. What we're saying is actually no. That's actually the worst thing that we can do. That would be great if there were 2 billion people on the world. Maybe the nature could actually accommodate us. But the problem is we're 7 billion going on 10 billion people. And what we need to do is use technology, high technology, and our ingenuity to rely less on nature. Rely less on nature for our food, rely less on nature for our water, for all our resources, and our energy. And this is really a very, very different and almost diametrically opposed view, not of, our concern for the problem, but how we get out of this. And I think, for me, certainly it came out of seeing the environmental movement, for 25 years now, try to tackle the climate change problem with tools and tactics that were devised in the 1970s to combat, air and water pollution. And many of the sort of the philosophical underpinning that defines much of the environmental movement really comes out of the late 60s and early 70s. It's stuff I made a film about with Earth Days. And it's simply not worked. The situation with climate change is just getting worse and worse. Almost every metric you look at, the most obvious of which is that coal remains the most widely used source of energy and also the fastest growing source of energy. The fastest growing source of energy is coal to this day. I mean, that's appalling. How can that be? So we need to start thinking differently. And the manifesto was sort of a shot of over the bow, as it were, to try to draw attention to rather than seeing this as a political problem that requires a kind of maybe a social or political revolution in how humans behave, which a lot of environmental leaders are really calling for. It's a critique of capitalism and a critique, wanting to really upset our entire sort of social and political and economic order, to one that's really more of this is really a technical and engineering problem that many of which we have the solutions for, and a lot of things actually are improving. This is another thing. It's sort of getting away from the doom and gloom that everything is going to hell that you see with much in the environmental movement, and say, well, some things actually are going to hell. That's true. But some things are actually going in a really good direction. We should learn from that and apply it to other things. I mean, one example where I live in the Hudson Valley, the entire East Coast of the United States was clear cut 100 years ago because we were using wood for fuel, for building materials, everything. Use wood for everything. Now we don't do that so much, and the forests are abundant and grown back. I mean, this is an example. Where whales, we used to hunt whales to the brink of extinction for whale oil. Now we don't do that. We've shifted to other fuels. So there are examples in our history, and there are examples going on today of things that are positive that are happening. And I would say nuclear energy is another thing that environmentalists have completely blinded themselves to out of an ideological opposition that, again, is based out of the experience of growing up in the Cold War, and is not really based on looking objectively in how do we produce massive amounts of clean energy for a rapidly developing world that's using more and more energy every day. Most environmentalists will say, well, we just need to stop using so much energy. Well, that's easier said than done. It's certainly easy if you live in the West to cut back on your use of energy. Not that we're very good at that, but it's a hell of a lot more difficult to cut back on your use of energy if you don't have any energy.
Robert, that's right? Actually, that eco-modernist mindset that you're describing, that's one of the very first themes that comes up in Pandora's Promise. You were speaking with a former environmentalist, and he talked about this cynicism in the environmental movement, specifically what you said about all of their numbers about how we could replace everything with clean power, with solar, with geothermal, with tidal. They're based on us not using more energy than we're using right now, which we know.
It's based on using a hell of a lot less. If you look at their numbers, a hell of a lot less, and that's simply not going to happen.
Exactly, and he was saying...
We don't want it to happen. That's the other thing.
If that's the mindset that you're going to use, then it means that you're actually pro-coal. You're pro-dirty energy, because we're never going to be able to get enough out of solar, out of tidal, out of geothermal. And that's why you have these people. And again, we talked about this being a theme in some of your films. These people who were staunch environmentalists, who, as you said, grew up in the Cold War and just associated nuclear power with the nuclear bomb. And of course it's going to kill us. Of course it's going to destroy the planet. Of course it's dirty. Of course things like 3 Mile Island and Fukushima and Chernobyl prove that this technology is going to kill humanity. And they've turned around and they've said, you know what? If you actually do believe that we need a cleaner source of energy, then it's going to come out of nuclear power. It's not going to come out of anything else.
Well, it's not that it's not going to come out of anything else. It's just you can't, unless you want to condemn more than half the world to abject poverty, energy poverty, which is poverty, which is not going to happen. They are developing. It's not like we in the West can control what the rest of the world does anyway. But unless you want to do that, there's just no way you're going to power the entire planet with wind and solar in the next 50 years. And, there's just so much, like, this is another example. There's just so much misinformation and misunderstanding about the nature of energy and the nature of the problem based on people simply reading things that comport with their narrow worldview and never looking or really studying opposing views. You're always going to find data. You're always going to find books and academic studies that will agree with almost any perspective on any issue you can imagine. There's stuff out there you can find. But you have. I prefer to look at the sort of mainstream consensus in terms of energy. United Nations studies that really have done pretty good work on this stuff, and you can't get to where we need to go without nuclear. I'm not saying nuclear is going to be the only solution. There's other solutions. Some are better than others in different places. But to imagine a world that's powered entirely with clean energy without nuclear is a complete and utter fantasy. And in order to bring about, might it be technically feasible? Possibly, but you'd have to have a kind of Maoist, Pol Pot-like regime to bring it about. You'd have to have unlimited power, unlimited funds in perpetuity to do it. And, is that where we want to go? And even then it might not work. I mean, Germany, for instance, has gone this route, and they've got the entire political class and they've got popular support behind doing it, but they're still building coal plants, They've made some progress, but very, very little progress in really bringing down their CO2 emissions.
Let's talk about those numbers, because there were some numbers that were bandied around in Pandora's Promise, and there were some numbers that came out since the release of Pandora's Promise. We believe that we're going to double our energy consumption by 2050, that we're going to triple or quadruple it by the end of the century, because we've got more of these developing nations coming online. And again, this is one of the pieces I love from the film that talked about the transformative aspect of energy. Once you start getting electrical power in some of these developing areas, everything from the light bulb to everything that comes after the light bulb completely transforms what you can expect out of life. Now,
that's absolutely true.
But we've got Germany, which last year there was a huge jubilation over the fact that in one day in June last year, Germany produced half of its energy from solar. And people were pointing that and saying, see, that's all we need. We need this major investment like Germany's doing, or we need this major investment like China is doing, which was able to produce, 26 plus gigawatt hours with their green energy initiative. And that's all we need. But then you start looking at how much those countries actually consume in aggregate, and it's a tiny fraction, and it's a major capital outlay. So, I mean, that's why you make that conclusion that the only way to do this is those technologies in conjunction with nuclear, or those technologies in conjunction with coal. That's really your only two options at the moment.
Those pretty much are the choices, unfortunately, at this particular point in our stage of development. Maybe in 50 years we'll have nuclear fusion or something. I mean, I don't know. Or maybe we'll be able to power the world with spinach. I don't really care. But right now, in the here and now, before we really screw things up, we need to use what we have, and nuclear is one of the things that we have. The other thing I just wanted to point out to jump on, to continue on something you just pointed out. Another widely held belief within the environmental movement is that energy is a bad thing. That if you could provide humanity with all the energy it needed and wanted, that it would allow humanity to simply run roughshod over the natural world and destroy everything. So that what we need to do is to restrain humanity's use of energy, and one of the ways you do that is by tying us to natural forces like the wind and the sun, which sounds really kind of romantic, except what you're really talking about is denying the developing world the ability to develop, right? And when you do that, if you look around the world, the places that have the lowest birth rates and the cleanest environments are developed countries. So development, which comes with rising use of energy, actually, for instance, allows women to get out into the workforce and get an education. People tend to move to cities and not in the country, so they tend to not have so many children. They get wealthier, so they don't have any children, and they get wealthier and therefore become better stewards of the environment because it's something they really care about. I mean, in China, one of the main driving forces right now to clean up their CO2 emissions, among other things, is simply the air pollution. The middle class now in China is just not going to tolerate this level of pollution. They don't want to bring their children up in these polluted cities, and so it's causing political instability, and the government's responding accordingly. So actually, it's one of those things that in the 1970s, when we had this whole idea that there was this, the limits to growth, like there was only so far, we were going to, run out of oil and run out of gas and run out of coal and run out of copper and everything, that we had to restrain human development. We've now realized that, in fact, there's a lot more of this stuff than we ever imagined. And we've also realized that development actually can be a good thing, and that it for both humanity and for the natural world. Robert? And again, that's in the manifesto, and it's really a really different way of looking at the problem from how mainstream environmental groups have grappled with this.
I want to talk about the elephant in the room when we come back, because as good as this may sound, and we can talk about why electrical power is good for development, for humanity, for the natural world, but there's still going to be those people who are unswayed because they look at the dangers of nuclear power. And those are valid concerns. They're going to look at meltdowns. They're going to look at 3 Mile Island. They're going to look at Fukushima. They're going to look at Chernobyl. They're going to look at the nuclear waste problem, and they're going to say, it would be great if it worked properly, but it doesn't, so we need to move on. Let's have a discussion about that, because I think that's what most people actually want us to get our teeth in. But before we do that, let's go ahead and take a break to thank the second sponsor of this episode of Triangulation. Now, I understand it's not fun to borrow money. Nobody likes to borrow money. And there aren't very many good ways to borrow money today that don't involve a long process and something that's just a hassle, going through form after form with banks and trying to convince them that you've got a plan to pay them back and you've got some sort of business for this money. Well, you could go through that rigmarole. You could go through that hassle. You could go through what I found to be an incredibly degrading process, or you could get $35,000 from Prosper in as few as 5 days and be done with it. Prosper is a new way to borrow money. It's a lending marketplace that connects people who want to borrow money with those people who have money to lend. Now, they say you could borrow up to $35,000 in as few as 5 days and use that money for just about anything you desire. Pay off high-rate credit cards, fix up your house, even put it into your business. Now, this is something that I wish I had way back when I was still running my business before I entered the priesthood. I actually had a very successful business, a consulting firm here in the Silicon Valley with more contracts than I could handle. So I had to hire people to handle those contracts. Well, I was short on cash. So I went to the banks and I started to explain to them how my business worked and how I was cash flush. I just actually needed a bridge loan, just 30 days, and I could pay them back in spades. But I went from bank to bank to bank, and it became more and more depressing every time I had to try to explain my business plan. Well, if I had Prosper, I wouldn't have had to do that. Prosper's online marketplace connects those people who would want to loan money to me, to my business, who understand what I'm doing, and that makes all the difference. Don't rack up more debt on your credit card. Pay them off with Prosper. To check your low rate instantly without affecting your good credit, go to prosper.com/twit. That's prosper.com/twit. Now and for a limited time, Prosper is offering Twit viewers a $50 Visa gift card with your low interest rate. You can get up to $35,000 in your account in as few as 5 days and that $50 Visa gift card. Just go to prosper.com/twit. Prosper.com/twit for this special offer just for Twit viewers. And we thank Prosper for their support of Triangulation. I'm speaking with Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker, Robert Stone. And now we'd like to talk about Pandora's Promise. This is a film that people can still watch on Netflix, and I'm hoping that anyone in our audience who has not yet watched it on Netflix, if they have a Netflix account, will go home and watch it, because it is truly inspirational. It's a fantastic representation of the issues surrounding the use of nuclear power, why we have such a bad social stigma on nuclear power, and actually speaking to the people who were involved in creating some of that stigma. Robert, one of the scenes you have in your documentary is the protests over the opening of a nuclear reactor, and you have people who are saying it's going to irradiate our kids, and it's horrible because it releases thorium into the environment. And in what I think was documentary genius, there was a man who was passing out bananas to the protesters. And the point was, eating that banana would get you more thorium in your body than drinking the output directly from the nuclear plant. But people are so afraid of radiation because we don't really understand it.
Well, it wasn't actually thorium, but yeah, yes. The point was made. Yes, it's true. So, yes, I think there is this perception that okay, nuclear power, maybe accidents don't happen very often, but when they happen, they're so absolutely apocalyptic, right, that it's an unacceptable risk. It's an unacceptable danger. That is the perception. It's certainly what I thought for many, many years. But in fact, we've had nuclear power for about 50 years now. There's about 440 reactors, commercial reactors, operating all over the world. And in that time frame, we've had 3 serious accidents: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. 3 Mile Island didn't do anybody any harm. It was contained within there was a meltdown. It did melt down, but it was contained within the containment structure, and it cost a lot of money, but no harm was done to human beings. Chernobyl, which was a sort of a Soviet-era bomb factory, it was a reactor but also made plutonium for bombs, and it had no containment at all, exploded and caused was the worst nuclear accident in history. 10 times more radiation released there than in Fukushima, and then of course we had Fukushima. So according to the World Health Organization, that's studied all of these events and has done long-term epidemiological studies, particularly at Chernobyl, which we've now had nearly 30 years of experience in terms of long-term impact there. According to their report, and you should go online and read it if you don't believe me, less than 60 people were killed as a result of that accident, even after all these years. And they were all people who flew in with their helicopters, putting out the fires that happened. And in Chernobyl, nobody has died or in Fukushima, nobody has died or even gotten sick as a consequence of the radiation released there. And according to the WHO, there'll be no statistical evidence foreseen of any uptick in cancer as a result of that. And so, no, these aren't nothing. These events are not nothing, but you compare it to the alternative, which is burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, again, according to the World Health Organization, cause the premature death of about 3 million people every year. 3 million every year, okay? Now, say you extrapolate that over the 50 years of that we've had nuclear power, you would have 150 million people whose lives were cut short by burning fossil fuel and air pollution, and 60 is a consequence of nuclear power, and yet all the focus is on nuclear. So what's interesting to me is that per unit of energy produced, per terawatt, nuclear is about the safest form of energy we have. The second only, I think, to wind. And there's some studies that say it's actually the safest. But all of them, all wind, solar, geothermal, they're all very, very safe forms of energy. And then you get oil, gas, and coal being the worst, or just absolutely off the charts. If your concern is about is about human health. But of course, there's all kinds of mythology about this. I know a lot of people think the entire Pacific is contaminated with radiation and all this kind of stuff. It's not true, but that's what they believe because they've been told it by activists. And, you know, all I can tell you is I used to believe these people too. And I now understand that they are simply not telling us the truth. They're zealots who believe they're doing good because they see nuclear weapons as an absolute evil. And I would kind of agree with them on that. And they see nuclear power as equated with nuclear weapons, and therefore anything that they say, truthful or otherwise, to rid the world of this absolute evil is justified.
And speaking of absolute evil, it's interesting that the United States bought over 1,600 nuclear warheads from Russia and Ukraine and turned them into fuel for nuclear reactors. And yet people
That's right. It's an amazing thing. Like, nobody knows. 1 in 10 light bulbs in this country is powered by the energy from a former Soviet nuclear weapon that was aimed at the United States. I mean, that's incredible. That was a treaty that was negotiated by President Clinton in 1993, I believe. And it's done more to de-weaponize, de-nuclear weaponize the world than anything. And so we've been downgraded the fuel in those nuclear weapons and put them in, shipped them over to the United States, and downgraded, downblended them because weapons fuel is over 90% pure, and reactor fuel is around 3% pure. So it's downblended, then put in a reactor and turned into electricity, and it disappeared. I mean, that's a great thing. And with advanced reactors, we can start to do that with weapons-grade plutonium as well.
Let's talk about those advanced reactors, because one of the segments in your documentary is talking about these 4th-gen reactors, which currently only exist in the lab. They've built one. It works. It's impossible to melt down. It actually can recycle used fuel from old plants. So it sounds a lot like a renewable resource. It could deal with the waste problem that we currently have, although there's really not a whole lot of high-level nuclear waste that's actually been created in the operation of nuclear plants around the country. And we aren't using it because people are so afraid of nuclear power. We haven't built a new nuclear plant since 3 Mile Island.
Well, we're not. Yeah, well, the R&D on this effort was there was a huge amount of money that was put into it to develop a totally new type of reactor that would solve all of the problems that people had with light water reactors, having to do with safety, waste, weapons proliferation, and cost. And those problems were pretty much solved. But the R&D was cut off in 1994. Really sort of a political give back of the Clinton administration to supporters of the anti-nuclear movement who supported him, and others in Congress. So we've been for 20 years. This very exciting technology is kind of laying dormant. It's now being ramped up again. There's a lot of startup energy companies right now. They're developing advanced reactors. And China's moving ahead. They've got one plugged into the grid now. They're moving ahead. The Russians are moving ahead. So advanced reactor technology is really taking off, but it's not taking off here so much because we're not really spending much money on any kind of energy R&D. And that which we do is really mostly related to hydrofracking and things like that. The United States has put most of its energy R&D into extracting more and more fossil fuels, with some energy R&D going into renewables. And obviously, government support subsidies going into renewables, but very little, has gone into nuclear, unfortunately, because we, did lead the world in that. These advanced reactors they're game changers. They're game changers, and the only argument that I get from anti-nuclear activists on this is, it's just pie in the sky. It doesn't exist. It's all fantasy. It'll never work. And they just don't know what they're talking about because these reactors have been proven. They've been tested over many years. Some of them have run for like 30 years without a problem. Some have been failures, absolutely, as in any kind of R&D effort. But yes, the physics of them prevent the kind of meltdowns that we've had in the past. You can disconnect all the cooling, all the power, everything, and they naturally, the physics of them will shut them down. They operate in a very different way. They don't require these redundant cooling safety devices that you have that make current generation light water reactors so expensive because the physics of them, they operate in a different way. And as you said, they're fueled by the nuclear waste that exists today that we've produced with light water reactors. So it's a way to get rid of the waste that we've had, is to feed them into these advanced reactors.
After watching your film, I actually started doing a little bit of research of my own into fourth-generation reactors, and I was looking at thorium reactors, I was looking at traveling wave reactors, and as you said, the physics that go into that technology, it's amazing. Yeah,
just go on Wikipedia. I mean, if you don't have to believe you or me, just go on Wikipedia, look it up. I mean, there's all kinds of information there.
And they've actually built these. I mean, this, like you said, this is not pie in the sky. This is not, well, if we invest billions of dollars into this, we could make one of this. It's, we know how to make it. We could make it right now if you gave us the money to build this plant.
Right.
And a lot of people don't realize.
Produced.
Yeah, exactly. And we could use all the fuel that the used fuel that is a waste. It's such a problem. We could turn it from a problem into actual power. And I don't know if a lot of Americans understand how much of their power still comes from nuclear reactors. What was it? Last year we generated 797 terawatt hours just from our nuclear plants.
But that doesn't mean anything to people. I mean, what people need to know is it's about 60%. I think over 60% of America's clean energy comes from nuclear. So if you got rid of nuclear, you'd be getting rid of 60% of our clean energy. It's about I think 18% of our total electricity comes from nuclear.
Right, and France is the cleanest country in Europe, and they generate 80% of their power from nuclear.
That's right. Yeah.
So I mean, what's the message that you would want to leave? I mean, we talked about why you became a filmmaker and why you stay a documentary filmmaker, because you want to make sense of your childhood. You want to tell a story. What story does Pandora's Promise tell? What part of your childhood is this making sense of, and what do you want to leave with the audience?
Well, I think a sense of optimism and hope that, yeah, we have some real serious environmental challenges, but we're also very clever, and we've proven that we can solve problems when we put our minds to it. Humans are very, very clever and very ingenious. We always have all kinds of failings and social failings and political failings and interpersonal failings, but we are very ingenious. And if we put our minds to solving problems, we can. And we were faced with a very serious environmental problem, many serious environmental problems, and problems with human poverty and preservation of natural resources and natural environments. But we need to, the one skill that we have, we can't turn back the clock. We can't start, we can't just like kill off all of humanity or half of humanity. We're stuck with a large population that's growing, and we should use all of our high technology and all of our ingenuity to lessen our reliance and interaction with the natural world, so the natural world can be, let nature be that nature, where there should be larger parts of the natural world that we just leave alone, and we can we should be using less land and less natural resources to supply our human needs, and we know how to do that using technology, and we should embrace that. So I think there's a lot of hope. Young people get this. Young people are very inspired by technology, and they see technology as something that can solve problems. And so I'm hopeful. I think, there are many impediments. So one of the impediments, I know obviously the, climate deniers are an impediment, but, they're more of a reaction than a real force of their own. I think it's sort of an excuse to say it's all the climate deniers. I think one of the problems is that we're not being realistic and not facing squarely the magnitude of the problem we face, and recognizing that there are things that are beyond our control, which is, for instance, there's an abundance of fossil fuels in the world. We're not running out of them. There's enough fossil fuels that if we burn it all, it's going to be really damaging. We have to use technology to replace the use of fossil fuels right away. That's a priority number one. And if you run the numbers, there's no way you can do this without a very serious ramp up in nuclear. And if you're going to do nuclear, do the latest, greatest, best type of nuclear, the safest type of nuclear, the one that produces the least amount of waste. And so I would, we should be putting our R&D and our efforts into that, I think, and that we could turn things around pretty quickly. I mean, one amazing statistic that's not in the film, I wish it was, I didn't know about it until after I finished the film, is that France went from 20% nuclear, which is about where the United States is today, to 80% nuclear, with the rest being, hydro mostly, basically 100% of their electric grid being carbon-free. They did that in 11 years, from 1979 to 1990, using 1970s era technology. And what's even more incredible with what the France model, what's even more incredible is that in those 11 years, they doubled the use of electricity by switching from home heating oil to electricity. Public transportation went to electricity. A lot of industrial processes went to electricity. So that's effectively going from 10% to 80% in just 11 years, again, using old-fashioned technology. So imagine what we could do today. And there's no amount of renewables, there's no example of renewables doing that rapid a scaling up anywhere in the world. There's no example that can be done.
That's definitely a narrative worth believing in. We've been speaking with Robert Stone, the Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker, maker of such films as Radio Bikini, Gorilla, The Taking of Patty Hearst, Oswald's Ghost, Earth Day, and of course Pandora's Promise. If you've got Netflix and you haven't watched Pandora's Promise, I don't know what you're doing. Robert, if you could please tell the folks at home where they can find you and find your work.
RobertStoneProductions.com. You can find out about what I'm doing. And yeah, a lot of stuff's on Netflix and iTunes, so check it out.
Thank you for joining us here for Triangulation. You've given our audience a lot of food for thought, and if the chat room is any indication, they're going to be talking about this for quite a while. I appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.
Folks, that's it for this episode of Triangulation. I want to thank you for joining us for our talk about documentary filmmaking and nuclear power. Yes, they do go hand in hand. Don't forget that you can watch Triangulation live every Monday at 11 o'clock a.m. on the TWiT TV network at live.twit.tv. As long as you're watching live, go ahead and jump into our chat room at irc.twit.tv so you can give the host feedback during the show. And we'll just be part of the experience that is TWiT TV. I'm Father Robert Ballecer in for Leo Laporte. Leo Laporte will be back next week. Until then, thank you for watching Triangulation.